Civil rights leader, theologian, and educator Howard Thurman wrote, "You must lay your lives on the altar of social change so that wherever you are, the kingdom of God is at hand." Welcome to the Thurman Conversations. The Reverend Dr. Howard Thurman believed that it was possible to humanize the other, for Black and brown and white people to find each other and be humans together in ways that make us come alive. Today, our conversation partner is the Reverend Isaiah Shaneequa Brokenleg, an enrolled member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe. She is staff officer for racial reconciliation for the National Episcopal Church. She is a priest in the Diocese of South Dakota, where she grew up in the place she calls home. Shaneequa has a Master's of Divinity from the Church Divinity School of the Pacific and a Master's of Public Health from the University of Minnesota. Prior to entering the priesthood, she worked as an epidemiologist and served Indian country in the Great Lakes region for over a decade. From a cultural, spiritual perspective, Shaneequa believes that we are all related, mitakuye oyasin, and that the gospel calls us to be good relatives to one another. Having grown up on the Rosebud Reservation, she has experienced and witnessed the devastating effects of historical generational trauma, colonization, and racism. As a Winkte, Lakota Two-Spirit person, she is called to be a healer and move our communities in the direction of positive change and reconciliation, and toward living in right relationship with one another. She strives to live out her calling through her work, our church, her art, and in her life. Our format for our conversations is designed for us to hear from Shaneequa and learn from her experience and knowledge. She and I will talk for about 40 minutes. During that time, you will be muted, but you can type your questions in the chat. We will gather the questions for the last 20 minutes and give Shaneequa a chance to answer them all, as many as we have time for. So if anything comes up, please put it in the chat. We would also like to thank the Race Task Force for the Episcopal Church in Colorado for creating this series with us. You can take a look at past speakers and their recordings on our website, and we will drop the link in the chat. I also would like to thank our producer, Michelle Auerbach. Shaneequa, welcome. Good to have you with us.
It's great to be here.
So, mitakuye oyasin, did I say that correctly?
No, but that's okay. It's mitakuye oyasin.
Oh, oyasin, thank you so much. Shaneequa, it's been a good week for the Supreme Court and the activists fighting for the racism of sports teams. Yet you have said that Native Americans are not fighting for equal rights, but for the rights you were promised. Can you share with us about Lakota history and how systemic oppression works here in the West?
How much time do we have?
As long as you would like to take.
So I think like socially and legally, we want equal rights, like we want to be treated the same and paid the same, those kind of things. But in other ways, we want the rights that we were promised in the treaties. And so, those are things a lot of times like land and fishing and hunting rights, that when Native folks gave up the land, they often retained the right to hunt and fish in those areas. And other things along that line. So often when we're arguing from this different perspective. Tribes also have tribal sovereignty. And so that's a different and unique relationship, nation to nation versus like a state to a nation, or a state to our country. And so when we talk about rights, it's kind of why it's different. And so sometimes that's why we look at things differently. Our history, I'm trying to think of the nutshell way to go about it. Like generally I kind of talk about like, if you think about it going way back prior to colonization, we had our own history and our stories, our creation stories, and our own cultures and all of that. And then with colonization, which was part of the doctrine of discovery, which is a series of decisions and pronouncements that church leaders have made that basically took away people's land, sovereignty, self-determination, and enslaved them and did all sorts of different things. And it was something that the church did. And then decisions later that came about as a result of that. I think if we're talking about, like, what does systemic oppression look like? It looks like us losing our land, losing our way of life, losing our sovereignty, and in decisions that people make continuing that same process. I think, like, if you were to think about Standing Rock and what happened with the Dakota Access Pipeline, that tribe should have had the right to say no to that for a long, long time, and everybody just kind of bulldozed right over them, literally bulldozed right over them, and didn't take that under consideration. And my biggest frustration about that whole thing was the pipeline was slated not to go on Indian land, but it was too close to the white town, and they got mad about that. So then they moved the pipeline over because it's okay, those are just brown people. They don't need clean water or anything like that. And that's a good example of how people in power make decisions that directly impact people of color in a disproportionate way. And that's called racism and structural violence. It also looks like our inability to police within our own communities. If I go into Minnesota and break the law in Minnesota, I will be arrested and charged in Minnesota. If a white person comes onto the reservation and commits a crime, they cannot always be tried by the tribal police on that reservation. And in fact, sometimes the only people who can come in and charge them are the FBI. And that was started to be changed with the Violence Against Women Act, which needs to be reauthorized because it doesn't include Alaska, and there's a bunch of other problems with it. But what was happening and still happens now are we have white folks coming onto reservations, victimizing, harming, molesting children, raping women, doing horrible things, and the police can arrest them, but they can't do anything about it. Like, they can't charge them, they won't go to jail, they just get released. That's the end of it. And the FBI doesn't want to get involved usually because unless it's like a murder, and even then sometimes they don't care. So that's another example of how structural violence, what that looks like in our communities. And then of course, in practice, some of the most racist towns are the towns near reservations. So like where I grew up, the town that we go shopping is Valentine, Nebraska, and Winter, South Dakota. And those are the places where you go and you're going to get followed around in the store, where there's certain seats that you're not supposed to sit in because those aren't for you. My grandfather, this was years ago, in Rapid City, which is one of those border towns, he went to church on Christmas Eve, and he was told that he couldn't sit down and he couldn't take part in that church service. Sorry, I don't think I was emotional talking about that, but that's one of those difficult things. Like, it's Christmas Eve and it's an Episcopal church, a part that, they came and Christianized our reservations. How on earth would he not be welcome there? But by the next year, he had built a church that's still in Rapid City called St. Matthew's. It's now the Indian church in that town. And still, that's typically the church of color, and not very many white people come to Emmanuel, which is the church that kicked my grandpa out for his brown skin. But that's what racism looks like in our community.
I need to sit with that a minute, because so much of what you just described feels like it should have been in another time. And it's here. You use the term racism equals structural violence. It carries a lot of power when you say it like that. For churches, when we are told by people that attending to systemic racism, white supremacy in our history is political, what do you have to say about that?
Well, I used to tell people the gospel is political. Jesus was a political person. Jesus was answering political questions about who is my neighbor. That's a political question. Jesus gave a political answer. And Jesus was killed because he was being political. He was shaking up those in the structures of power. And so our church, from its very beginning, was political. And if our church sees racism and white supremacy as a partisan political issue and not a moral one, our church has failed. That means our church has failed. We are not recognizing that of Christ in each other. We are not treating every human being with the dignity that they deserve.
Have you said, or in Michelle's notes, it is written that you referred to the church as a country club? Can you tell me about that? What is? Tell me what that means, or tell us what that means, because we hear that a lot. I'd love to hear you talk about it.
So I think sometimes we come to church, or people come to church for the wrong reasons, right? I'm going to talk for a moment about sacramental theology, but when I was younger, you learn about like transubstantiation, where the bread and wine literally become the body and blood of Christ, and you have consubstantiation, where it's a symbol, and as Episcopalians, we're supposed to believe in the real presence, or we don't know exactly how that happens, but Jesus is there some way or another. And I asked somebody this in college, and I thought I was being so smart. I'm like, do you believe in consubstantiation or transubstantiation? And he looks at me and he says, the real question is, do you believe in transformation? I'm like, ooh, what's this new theological construct? And I thought this was going to be some amazing thing he's going to lay down. He's like, these two things really don't matter unless you have been transformed. That's the question that you need to answer. Has your experience of coming to church, has your experience of taking part in communion and being present with Christ, has that transformed you? And if the answer is no, that means the church is not doing your job. That's why the church is not a country club. These aren't spiritual country clubs where we just go to come and feel comfortable and get our feet rubbed or whatever. I don't know what people do at country clubs because I've never been at one, but whatever. So they don't do that. And then it's not like a spiritual museum where things should never change. They should constantly be transforming and changing. That's the way our God is. Our God isn't some static God that just sits there and doesn't do anything. The Holy Spirit is present all the time, moving around. And so we have to remember that churches aren't those country clubs. They're not those museums. They are spiritual hospitals where we come to heal, where we come to be made whole. And healing is painful, and healing is uncomfortable. And our churches are going to have to go through that uncomfortable, painful stuff if we actually want to transform into the kingdom that God is calling us to become. And so that's why I think that's important. The alternative, if we don't do that, is to become a spiritual hospice, which is kind of, I think, what's happening in too many of our churches. And they come to church and they come and they sit and they just want to be told comfortable things from the pulpit. And I know because I challenge people from the pulpit and then they get mad at me. But if we just are on spiritual hospice, we just sit there and we take like the opiates of ignorance and apathy, that's fine. But that is where our church is going to go to die. And that's kind of what happens if you look around in our communities and in our congregations and see the dwindling numbers and the like average age increasing, which means we're not replacing the older folks with younger folks. So we need to think about that and think about how are we a transforming and growing and transformational church.
I just love what you're saying. Okay. As people in the West with a brutal settler colonial history, we are looking to heal our past. What kinds of skills and tools do we have to do this together as a people of faith?
That's a great question. Well, I think the tools that we have are, the gospel, right, which has tons of stories. And I think the main thing about those stories is that they all come down to relationship. How are we building relationship? Not relationship within our own small little buildings, church buildings, but how are we building relationship across those artificial lines and boundaries that society creates to keep us separate from one another? How are we transforming those relationships? How many of you have actually been outside of your church building and walked around a 1 or 2 block radius and know the different people that are in your neighborhood? Or maybe what kinds of organizations are there? And really think about looking outside of your own cultural context, right? We tend to associate and know people who are like us, but how often do we go out and with intentionality go out and meet and build relationships with folks who are different? That, I think, is the most powerful transformative piece that we can do. And Jesus did that all the time. Look at all those people he interacted with, and he got in trouble for it, right? They're like, what's he doing hanging out with tax collectors? And what's he doing hanging out with these women? And what's he doing? Like, but that's what he did. And because that's what the gospel calls us to do. So that's a powerful tool. And of course, like officially, under the church, we have our Building Beloved community, which is that you'll see it often as a labyrinth, and it's got like telling the truth, repairing the breach, sharing the vision, and practicing the way. And those are like the 4 pieces. But all of that comes back down to relationship. How is it that we do that? And I think in Lakota, we have a phrase, wo Lakota. And it's the state when all things are in right relationship with one another. When we are in right relationship with God, when we are in right relationship with creation, when we are in right relationship with each other, and when we are in right relationship with ourselves. And that, I think, is, as we head toward that, if that's the direction we're going, that's where we will find reconciliation. Or maybe we go to reconciliation to get to that place of being in right relationship.
So this is the work you do, right, with the National Church, trying to help people to use these tools. Tell us a little bit more about that. When you go to a place and or from your office there in South Dakota, what exactly does your work look like from day to day?
It looks a lot different than I thought it was. So I should start by saying I just started in January. And my predecessor, Heidi, did a lot of wonderful, very important work. And I should also say that the church is not just a national church, but it's international church. So we're on like all over. A lot of what I do is, again, building relationships and interacting with folks and really listening for what they're asking me or what they're telling me, and then trying to figure out what tools do I know or have that I could sort of maybe help or support or partner with them in their journey. Or is there somebody else that could share, introduce them to again, build relationships and support and help them in their journey? I think we put, of course, a bunch of stuff out. So we've got like the labyrinth thing. Now we're doing this thing about, I'm going to mess it up because it's very brand new. Healing is one of them. Justice is one of them. There's a thing that's coming out in 28th, 29th, and 30th. So they're doing some workshops there. I'm helping with the one on healing. And we've got like after the George Floyd's murder, we came out with this Learn, Pray, Act, which you can see on our website. And it just gives you some tools to learn about racism, some things to pray and think about as you're doing it, some prayers, and then some ways to act, ways to actually work toward creating change and being Christ's hands and feet in the world. And right now, currently, a lot of some of what we're doing is we're doing a racial audit. So we picked 3 dioceses in each province, and they're getting, we are interviewing the diocesan leaders there. We've already interviewed the House of Bishops, and we've already done the staff at 815, and I'm forgetting somebody else, maybe the House of Deputies. There's another group anyway that we're interviewing, and we did some regular survey, and then we're doing some like one-on-one interviews, and we'll have a report hopefully by the time General Convention rolls around that can tell us kind of the state of our church in terms of leadership and in terms of race and racism. And there's other stuff I just can't think of it all right now.
That's okay. That's a lot. So can you tell us a little bit about, or at least something that you're learning about us as an denomination, the Episcopal Church?
Oh yeah. So I didn't know this because I'm coming from my own context, right? I'm learning that our church is really white. I did not know that. Our church is about 90% white, and growing up on the reservation, the majority of the people on our reservation are Episcopalian. And growing up, I thought it was the Indian church, and my grandpa was a priest, and so I saw him, and I saw the other native priests, and we sang in Lakota, and everything on our church list said IHS, which where I come from means Indian Health Service. And so I thought, oh, well, this is a wonderful thing. You know, the Indian Health Service cares about our physical health and our spiritual health. And so they just give us these churches and they provide us with our spiritual needs. And it wasn't until my grandpa took me to some convention or something that I realized that there were white people in the Episcopal Church. And then, of course, you know, after I got older and saw, then I learned that the Episcopal Church was a very white church. So that's something I've learned. I've learned that as a whole, we're scared of doing stuff. We're scared of opening that door and going out and interacting with folks who are different from us. It's much easier for us to sit in the pew and write a check. It's much easier for us to kind of not take those risks. I think we're afraid as Episcopalians of failure when that's just a part of life. You have to try things. You have to do new things. And I also think that I'm seeing like a culture shift. I think our church used to be like the church of wealth and power, you know, as the Church of England. And it often tended to be like people used to say it was I can't remember what they said, the something at prayer. Anyway, that was what the Episcopal Church was. It was definitely the folks that were in power. I think it was the Republicans at prayer or something like that was what we used to call. And then you see that. And then as a result of our like baptismal covenant, other things that we've done, then you start to see this cultural shift where we're often now sort of seen as somewhat progressive. And so those two things are sort of clashing. And I think you're seeing some of that come out and some of what's going on. And I think we have to sort of start thinking about and answering the question, how do we work together? How do we overcome our differences? And I think that's a national conversation that's going on, not just within our church, but within our entire society. You have, you know, and it's always happening, but you have, you know, older folks and younger folks with different generations. You've got people of color and white folks. White folks used to be at least by numbers, the majority. And that's starting to shift now. And pretty soon you're going to see that shift. And I wonder what that will be like. There's going to be some, I think, some fear that will take place when that happens. And I think in our church, we have our first presiding bishop who's a person of color. And I think that's a whole nother conversation that we have to have. And I see some of the comments made on our Episcopal Church page when he spoke out against our president taking a picture by our church building with the Bible after he tear gassed everybody and pushed them out the way. People thought that was not okay for our bishop to speak out about that. And I think we should be asking ourselves why we think that. What's that about? Anyway.
Oh, I for one was happy that he did it. So in Colorado, I feel like we had started a rapid fire at the beginning because we were running a little bit behind. So we'll slow down for a second and just let you take your time with however you want to. In Colorado, we are confronting racism on many fronts, from our Klan history to the ways the church was complicit in the genocide of Native peoples, to how immigration is a racism issue. What would you like for us to know and do as we work towards justice?
I think, thinking about that, that beloved community, you have to tell the truth. Tell the truth about the Klan history. Tell the truth about the complacency and the racism of the genocide of American Indians. I think that's important because if you just try and hide it, it's going to come back and bite you at some point. But if you're able to tell the truth and say, that that's a part of our history that we're not proud of and that we actively are working to change, that says a lot. And then, of course, repairing the breach. So how, if we have done those things that have harmed communities of color, how are we repairing the breach? How are we building relationships with communities of color? How are we being a good neighbor to those communities in a way that's meaningful and not just lip service? I think that's going to be a question. And then, of course, proclaiming whatever the vision is that we're looking for. One of the things that I think is interesting that I see in churches a lot is we all want visitors. Like, oh yeah, we need new people. And it's like, if new people come, we're like, ooh, we get so excited. But we want them to come and we want them to be just like us. And we want them to like the same music that we like. And we want them to pray just like us. And if we really want to be transformative and get new people, because the people who are just like us, let's be frank, are either in church or they're not going to come. So you want to get the people who are different. You want to get those other folks. We need to radically think about how we are church. Like when you have new folks come, rather than just saying, be like us, maybe ask the question, what kind of things do you like? What kind of ways could we make sure that your culture is reflected in the service? What kind of, are we always, okay, I mean, some of my bias is going to come out, but so I used to be a member of a church and in Wisconsin. I love that church, but they always sing the Baroque music and it's Baroque. And I'm like, why can't we ever sing some like contemporary stuff? And I remember when we were looking for a new rector, they were like, I was on the search committee and they were like, it's really important we get a rector that likes the music we like. And I'm like, do you mean the music you like? Because I don't like that music. And it's like these assumptions that we think that everybody thinks like us. And so we have to really radically shift and think about what that looks like. And as a result, let me just say, in that church, they were 12 miles from an Indian reservation. And they decided that they really wanted to work with youth because their average age is like 70 years old. And they really wanted to work with natives. And so we did a native service and we invited the native community and we had like a potluck afterwards. And the first year, I think there was like 3 native people that showed up besides me. And, but then the next year we had like 15 and the next year we had like 30. And then after that, it just was big. It was so big. We like were busting at the seams. And I think because we reached out and because we built those relationships, that was really powerful. But then you need to be ready for those people to come in your church, right? And so like natives from that community is very impoverished folks, are very impoverished folks. And so they're going to bring with them their poverty. That means they're not going to have nice cars that are in your parking lot. That means, you want children? Well, they're going to bring their children because we have a lot of babies. And that means that there's going to be children making children noises in your church too. And so you have to think about, are we ready for that? And the correct answer is we need to be. And then how are we going to be welcoming to them and recognizing that, for all of us, we have some privileges and that means that other folks have disadvantages. And so when you're inviting people to come in your church, especially if they're the folks with disadvantages, that means you might have to give up some of your privileges in order for them to actually be welcome there. I don't even remember what the question was. I just started going off. I'm sorry.
No, you ended at a good spot. Give up privilege. That's something we could do. So as a sort of a follow-up to that, to how do we confront racism here in the West in our church? We talk a lot about being part of the solution, but how can we also fight the problem as not just as a church, but as individuals, and help lead our institutions into being people who fight the problem and resistors?
Well, be involved, be active. We need to go from the pew to the protest. We need to go from the pew to the public square. We can't just sit and be okay with it. And I remember having a really difficult conversation with my mother. So I'm half Lakota and half white. And my mother, who is white, after I went to the protest for George Floyd in Sioux Falls, and I remember her calling me and she's like, I don't understand why you have to protest. I don't understand why it's important. She's like, why can't you just, go to the people in power and tell them that you want change? I'm like, because it doesn't work that way. I had to sort of like really break it down. And we had a difficult conversation about white privilege. She didn't know who Ahmaud Arbery was. And I was like, well, if you were a person of color, you would know who that was. And she's like, I just don't want to watch the news. I was like, well, that doesn't matter because your friends would have called you and you would have talked to them about it because it was, in a discussion amongst communities of color. And she's like, you make me sound like I'm a terrible person. And I was like, no, you're not a terrible person. You just need to be more aware. And then she got upset and I'm like, that's called white fragility, Mom. And it was just like this difficult conversation. And so lucky I am that I have a mother that loves me, whom I love, that we can continue talking even through that difficult conversation, even through those difficult places. And I think that conversation was a transformational piece for her. And I think she's slowly starting to think about different things. And we're talking about racism. And, she's like, I'm not going to walk in a protest, but she's like, I can do other things. For example, voting. Very important. For example, when you hear things, speak out. You cannot be silent. That's the other thing I think that I learned about our church, and especially some of our clergy in our church. They don't know what to say, so they say nothing. But when you say nothing, you are tacitly approving of the oppression that is happening to people. And so I can't remember, Eli Wiesel said something like that, and so did Martin Luther King Jr. He said something like, in the end, you will not remember the words of your oppressors, but you'll remember the silence of your friends. We cannot be the silent friends. We need to be allies and not even just allies, co-conspirators in the activity of justice.
So can you talk so much about relationships? As I take notes, you've mentioned it, I think 4 times already. And how does your notion of relationships, and you mentioned your mom and family, how has that been shaped by being a native, by being Lakota? How would that be different from those of us who didn't grow up in a community like Rosebud?
I think that's a good question. Well, just like you said when you were sort of reading my bio, in Lakota we have a phrase, "Mitakuyo Yasin." That means that we are all related. That phrase, it can mean we are all related. It can mean God bless all my relatives. It's what we say when we end a prayer. And the gospel message is to be a good relative. And so that, I think, comes down, and that's what I learned growing up. And I think in practice, I saw that in the way that my grandfather and grandmother lived their life. He was a priest on a reservation, and at the time that he became a priest, Native priests were paid less than white priests. He had the same degree. He went to CDSP, had the same degree as the other priests, but he got paid less because his skin was brown, which later, even though they changed that rule, meant that his pension was less because all those years that he wasn't earning. So he was still paying for that sin earlier in the pension that he got. But that didn't stop him from being a good relative. I went with him when he would go, we'd visit. In the wintertime, he would go and see some of the single people who lived alone, the elders and stuff, and we would bring them food. It was very much an activity. And I think it was then that I also learned what it means to be a clergy in Indian country and what it means to be a leader. For us, leadership is very much a servant leadership. It's very much a lead by example. And it's very much, you're only a leader in so much as people are following you, not because you have a title or anything like that. And so he led by example, and you see other people doing that. And I think growing up, it would sort of tell me those things, with great privilege comes great responsibility. And you have to, in my role as a weekday, I have to be a servant to my community. And if people say pray, I need to go pray for them. If people say whatever, you need to go do that. That's how I think I see relationships looking different. And it's just like maybe a deeper sort of sense of relationship. Like you're not just committed to your family, which I think is what a lot of people think of when they think of relationships, like your primary family. Your family is everyone. So if you're driving down the road and somebody's walking, you need to pull over and give them a ride. And I saw that happen. If, somebody comes and knocks on the door and it's dinner time, you are going to feed them. And if you don't have enough food, you just put a little more water in the soup and everything's going to be fine. And that's just kind of what you are called to do, I think, as a person. Oops.
So, are you still there? Oh, hey. Did we lose Shaneequa?
We were warned this might happen, and she'll come.
I'm here.
Oh, okay.
Oh, you're there. Okay.
I could hear you. I called in. That's why I call in, because South
Okay.
Dakota apparently doesn't have the greatest internet access.
So I wanted to go back to what you said about your mom and your conversation with your mom, and if my experience is similar with my mother in different ways, all the tension that's there. What can you say to us about how to deal with the tension that's not just in our family relationships but also in our communities?
Well, for me, I use humor a lot to help bring about understanding. I use humor, and I think acknowledging that tension. If you pretend it's not there, that's a problem. And I think sometimes we tend to do that. We tend to just be like, oh, we're going to just act like nothing's wrong and it'll be okay or whatever. But it's better just to call it out right away when something happens. And you can save a lot of grief that way, I think. And for my mom, her and I haven't always had the best relationship. But I think the times that our relationships have grown the most and become the most strengthened is when we can just be honest with each other and say something like, you know, when this happened, that really hurt me, or I'm scared right now, or I need to be vulnerable, but I'm scared to be vulnerable, or whatever. Those kind of things, I think, are things that I think can be really transformative. We don't always have to be this perfect front, right?
Well, you said your mom. You said my mom who loves me, which I thought was awesome. You know your mom loves you. Okay, so we're at about 7:40, and our producer's got some questions for us. Is there anything else you want to say before we move to some questions?
No, I'm good.
You good? Okay.
Lane, bring on the questions.
Bring them on. Okay. Let's see. Question. Is there any intersectionality in your work, in the work you do?
Oh, everything we do is intersectional. I think that was one of the biggest things that I think I struggled with in seminary. As Indian people, we don't separate. It's hard for us to separate like our physical life and our spiritual life, or our family relationships and our neighbor relationships, because we see everything as connected. And it's a very Western idea to have very boxy things. And so I'm not just the Indian person. I'm also a Winkte. I also am an American. I'm also, part of the LGBT community. I'm also a clergy. And all those things come together to make me who I am, just like they make you who you are, right? Think of it like a flower. So, we're all beautiful flowers, and each petal might be one of our identities. If you just look at the petal, you can't tell a lot about that flower, because of all these other pieces you have to see as a whole person. And so everything we do is interconnected and intersectional. One person asked me one time, I was a coworker, and he said, he was super racist. But anyway, he was like, have you ever actually been discriminated against because of your race? And I had to think about it for a minute. I was like, I don't really know, because sometimes I get discriminated because of my race, and sometimes because of my sexuality. I don't really know. I can always tell the difference. Maybe it's both. And right. That's when we went on a whole nother road. And after that, he didn't really talk to me anymore. But it's intersectional.
So you said Winkte. You said you were a Winkte person. Tell us about that.
Let me think of how I can explain that. So Winkte in Lakota culture is a third gender. It's one of those things that's kind of difficult, but it is. It's a third gender, and we believe that those people are sacred, and they walk between the worlds of the masculine and the feminine, and the natural and the supernatural. And they're often called to be in that like third way, or in that middle role, that liminal space. And often that's why I see my role in reconciliation so directly related to that, because, being both part colonizer and part colonized, right? And also walking in between those roles. Traditionally, we were healers, spiritual healers, historians, translators, and we serve the community. And growing up, my grandparents told me about those people. They didn't tell me I was one of those people, but they knew because they didn't tell my cousin stories about Link Days as much as they told me stories about them. And it's a unique spiritual and social role. And I think for me, it's again one of those intersectional pieces where when I used to go into LGBT areas, like I could only be LGBT. They didn't want to hear about their racism or their misogyny. But when I go into Indian country, I can be the whole me. I can be both Lakota and Winkte, and I don't have to try and decide between those two things. Mm-hmm. It's a very integrated and positive space to be, I think. So I guess I don't know what else to say about it. I'm sure that there's other stuff I could say, but.
No, that's good. It seems like a special window into the world in some ways. The way you were describing it felt like that. One of the questions is, do you think the pandemic and Zoom church have done much to change relationships? And how might we use this time and these circumstances to look beyond ourselves?
Oh, yeah. I think this pandemic has made our relationships as church communities, I think it's challenged them a lot, right? It's been difficult because we're so used to seeing each other and interacting with each other on this very foundational level. And then sometimes I think Zoom church can feel less something. And sometimes it can also feel really transactional. At the church that I help serve in Sioux Falls, after church we go and we give communion, and it's drive-by communion. Like they pull up, we give them in a little dime bag. We give them the Eucharist wafer in a dime bag. And then often they'll hand us their pledge check. So it's this very weird transactional thing. And it feels weird to me, but it's like, what are you going to do? And I know folks are really excited about opening up. But we're about to hit the second wave, or this really messy area and it's already way up there with the rate of virus. But at the same time, I'm seeing a very different way and thought about relationships. So, maybe it's just me that's seeing it, but if we think about who are those essential workers, a lot of them are brown folks and Black folks that, there's something we preached on where we talk about fruit or something. I can't remember what the sermon was, but if you think of like eating an apple or like a pear, you think that the white part is like the best part, right? But what we forget is the core, those black and brown seeds, those are the most powerful part because they can grow a whole nother orchard. And that I think is our essential workers. Those are the core of our society right now. Those are the people who are picking our food. Those are the folks who are working in the grocery store. Those are the folks that are delivering our groceries. They are risking their lives to support us so we can afford and be privileged and sit inside our homes and not have to interact with others. And if we think about that, that is a relationship. It might not be a constant relationship that we're talking about, but that is a relationship. And it might put it more into perspective for us to think about it that way. I also see other amazing things that folks are doing. After George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis, they asked for, I think they wanted 60 bags of groceries, and folks brought 36,000 bags of groceries.
Oh my God.
That came, and right, exactly. That is an example of how we're rethinking how we are church, or rethinking how are we community. And there's a woman that I know at one of the churches here, and she's watching the streaming church service, and at the same time she's selling masks, and she brings those masks after church every Sunday so that folks can have them that can't afford them or can't make them, or whatever. We have a lot of homeless folks and folks that are like marginally housed that will come to the church for services at the cathedral, and so they can have those masks then.
So another question, what do you say to people when they say that Christianity is a settler colonist religion that was brought here, and yet you're an Episcopalian, you're a Christian? How do you reconcile those?
So that's a really good question. And it's not the first time it's been asked, but I think, yes, with colonization came Christianity. And Christianity in many cases came before colonization, but sometimes they came with it. Mm-hmm. And I think what we have to remember, when we buy into this idea that Christianity, which often I hear in Indian countries, that Christianity is the white people's religion, it is the brown people's religion that has been co-opted by the white people in many cases. We have to remember that Jesus was a brown person himself, right? And so we can't always buy into that. But and for I think a lot of us, as we thought about it as Lakota people, we are a very ecumenical people. Like we love hearing stories from other tribes, because other tribes we interact with, they have their own unique creation story, their own ceremonies, but yet we still interacted with them and we could still pray together. And so I think as Christianity came, we were very interested in hearing that story, and we were interested in telling our story. And at the best of times, that's what happened. There was this exchange and a growth, and it was wonderful. At the worst, sometimes it was like, if you want to eat, you need to get baptized. And I shouldn't laugh because it's not that funny. But you know, that's what happened. And for me, I see Christianity, and the way I've been taught about it, is it's about transformation. It's about being a good relative. It's about liberation. Jesus came and helped to liberate folks who were oppressed. And we as Indian people were being oppressed by the colonizers. So even though they're feeding us this Christianity, if you read it and you learn about it, it's about setting the oppressed folks free. And for me, that's what I identify with. That's what I think about when I think about that transformational piece. Because Jesus didn't come to colonize, Jesus came to talk about peace. And Jesus himself, whether it's hard to realize this, wasn't a Christian, Jesus was a Jew, right? I always get frustrated with people like, Jesus was the original Christian. Like, no, Jesus was a Jew.
So how, in what ways has being a Christian inform the way, or being Lakota inform the way that you worship as a Christian? What gifts do you think Native culture brings to our worship in the Christian church?
I think the way we approach the sacred is a little different. I think Western society they want to box everything in and understand everything and figure everything out. And I think as Lakota people, we can say that, like, God isn't something that's meant to be understood, right? Because God is God. You're never going to be able to understand God fully, right? So a lot of like our ceremonies and our sacraments, they're not meant to be understood. They're meant to be experienced. And it's through that experience of the sacred that then we gain understanding, or we gain more understanding. And I think that's the big piece. I also think we tend to think of things in fours, not threes. And so for us, Trinity is a little bit difficult concept. But again, if you were to add in relationship, then Trinity can be the three plus us, and that makes four. And so we don't like get what it's called. Systematic theology is not typically a way we do things for us. Theology is much more of a conversation and a dialogue and an experiential thing. And I think the way I'll explain it this way. So I think back in the day, when Christians were having dialogue and they were trying to figure out, must one become a Jew to become a Christian? And Paul said, no, you don't have to become a Jew to become a Christian. And somehow colonizers forgot about that. And so they somehow translated that into, we must become white before we become a Christian. And so they sort of rejected all of those things that the Native people have as our own creation stories and our ceremonies and our histories. Jewish people have those too, and we call it the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. And those are sacred in and of themselves and an important part of our faith, just as our creation story, just as our origin story, just as our ceremonies of Lakota people are sacred in and of themselves. That's our Old Testament. And so we don't throw away that either. Those are both sacred pieces, and they need to come together, and they do in the way that we pray. And so it's, the other thing I think about is just a really embodied liturgy. I think as Lakota people, while we don't think of ourselves as high church, the way we do our spiritual practices, at least traditionally our ceremonies, it's a very embodied liturgical practice. You know, your sweat lodge, or if you're smudging, it's all very embodied. You're moving, you're dancing, you're singing, you're praying with your whole self, all your senses. And I think worship can be like that in our faith too, if we think about it. It might look a little different. You know, you have a thurible instead of a smudge pot or whatever, but it'll look different.
So one of our previous speakers talked about having representations of Jesus in our churches that are all white. What are your thoughts on how we might approach that now?
Well, so we know why that happened. I'm sure we know that happened because Jesus was God becoming incarnate in our world. And so and that was really, as human beings, that was us being able to connect to God on a same level, on a human to human level, right? And God, of course, is fully divine and fully human, but on a human to human level. And so because of that, we want to connect with Jesus in that same way. And so for a lot of folks, they created Jesus that looks like them. And so you might have the African Jesus as the church spread to Africa, an Asian Jesus, the Russian Jesus, the Greek Jesus, the white Jesus too. The problem occurs when colonization happened or slavery happened. Instead of allowing the folks that are learning about Christianity to have a Jesus that looks like them, which is the same gift that whoever they learned Christianity from gave them, like giving them a Jesus that looked like them, a white Jesus, or allowing them to think about it that way. They didn't give us that privilege. They said, here's your white Jesus. And they didn't give us the opportunity to have an Indian Jesus or a black Jesus or a Jesus that looked like us. I think that's the mistake that happened. And we should really be thinking about that. As Americans, you know, you're on Indian land everywhere you go. And so why don't we have a Jesus that's brown or has long hair like Indian people do or did? And, or a Jesus that resembles us. We don't, and instead we promote this other Jesus. And I think that's what skews and creates part of that problem, part of that white supremacy in our religion.
So can I put you on the spot? Can I
Sure.
ask you, somebody asked if you would say a Lakota prayer?
Sure. How about I'll sing the doxology in Lakota. We do that almost every,
Okay.
in a lot of churches in our diocese, even the white churches, they'll usually sing the doxology in Lakota. They'll sing the English in Lakota, but I'll sing it for you. Give me a second.
No worries.
Okay. It goes like this. Atea pichin kukin naonia waikanti he wakantanga wajina kin he wo wita yuhanue. Amen.
That is so awesome. Thank you. Thank you for giving us that. I really appreciate your time and for sharing your experience with us and your knowledge and your spiritual gift. So can you stick around for a minute? I want to ask you a question at the end, and we're going to sort of close out and announce our next show.
Yes, of course.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. We'll be back in 2 weeks on July 29th with Laura Piniche from the Colorado Immigrants' Rights Coalition and the Modus Theater Company. Originally from Puebla, Mexico, Laura is a documentary filmmaker and has had films in the Stars Film Festival and on our Rocky Mountain and national PBS stations. Laura will be sharing some theater, sound, some film, and a lot of experience with being a dreamer, working for the Undocumentologs, and working on the ICE Incident Report Hotline. This conversation series is sponsored by the Race Task Force of the Episcopal Church in Colorado and by St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Lakewood. Our producer is Michelle Auerbach. Shaneequa, thank you for being here, being a part of our conversations. Our producer told me that you were a badass in the church, and she is so totally right. A force for good. So how can we find you? What resources can you direct us to?
I should have had that ready. I didn't realize. Definitely, you can find us on Racial Reconciliation. Give me a second, and I'll put the link in the chat. And you can find me. I'll put my email in there too.
Okay.
And of course, I'm on Facebook, so you can, if you find me on Facebook, and you can friend me. But I'm going to ask you how I know you, and it's just to avoid spam. So pretty much, as long as you say something halfway cogent, it will be okay. Cool. There we go. And yeah, and right now we're also putting together, well, I'm working with some folks, that's very, not part of my work, but very ground, that we're putting together like a LGBT pride service that'll stream at some point. We've been working on that.
We'll be on the lookout. Again, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you and a blessing to us. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Join us again on July 16th when we talk to Laura Pinochet. And if you like what you are hearing here, don't tell us, tell your friends. Stay safe. Be a good neighbor. Good night, everybody. Thank you. See you.
Thank you.